have a follow-up video in response to a question I received, and I get the words of a inverse functions are quite difficult, especially when we switch around the x and y coordinates and the domain and range of the functions switch around as well. So I'm just going to start off, pardon me, with the function f of x. Now I just drew f of x, and I'm going to say I picked out its domain, I picked out its range, and I put three important points A, B, and C. Now, since the inverse function is a reflection about the identity line, I'm going to map the image point of A, which is A primed or A inverse. So this was negative 5, 1. This should be negative 1, negative 5. And it is. So that's good. I'm going to do the same thing for B and the same thing for C. So I've mapped out the image points using the reflection about the identity line, or very simply, you could just switch the x and y coordinates. And I'm just going to connect the dots, and in fact, here is my inverse function. So the red represents the function f of x, the blue represents my inverse function f negative 1 of x. So the question was, do my axes switch? And I guess in a really abstract sense they would, but don't do that. It'll confuse you. What ends up happening is the x's and y's switch. So for image point C, the x, or the input, I'm going to say, the independent variable, was 0. This should say C inverse. So the independent variable becomes the dependent variable. Or the dependent variable, or the output, becomes the input. And really, this is just building off the theme that the x's and y's switch places. So in other words, since the domain is a descriptor of what x values our function can have, on the inverse, the range would be the same as the domain for f of x. Also, the range for f of x becomes the domain on the inverse. I hope this settled things up. I know it can be a little bit crazy with the verbiage that is being used, but I think that's it in a nutshell. Take a look. All our themes are there. It's a reflection of about the identity line, y is equal to x. The x's and y switch points, the domain and range switch for the inverse and the regular function f of x.